Identifying and discussing events and laws which serve as a foundation for current special education legislation protecting the educational services of students with exceptionalities. Compare and contrast the issues surrounding inclusion instruction for students with exceptionalities. A few events that happened that made laws possible for students with special needs. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court determined separate but equal education is illegal. In 1970, Dana v. State Boards of Education, the court ruled that children cannot be placed in special education based on cultural bias tests. In 1972, Pennsylvania Associated for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mills versus Board of Education established the right to education for students with disabilities and found that denial of education violates the Fourth Amendment. In 1977, Larry P. versus Riles, a court ruled that the use of standardized IQ tests for placement into special education classrooms for students with educational mental retardation was discriminatory. 1982 Board of Education versus Roll. The Supreme Court defined free and appropriate education and directed the public schools must provide appropriate special education services. 1992 Orbiti versus Board of Education of the Borough of Clementon School District. A federal district court ruled that a self-contained special education classroom was not the least restrictive environment for students with Down syndrome. The court ruled that school districts were obligated to first consider regular class placement with supplementary aids and services before considering alternative placement. Now we're going to move on to the laws. In 1973, Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And what that is, it is a civil rights law that prevents discrimination against individuals with disabilities by any institution that receives federal funds and provides for a free, appropriate public education. Now, some private schools that doesn't apply because they don't get federal funds, they can be exempt from this. The law also applies to both to schools and to the workforce, which is actually different than what IDEA, which I'll get to in a little moment, is. There's a difference between the two. And unlike IDEA's guidelines, Section 504, they must demonstrate a significant learning problem that affects their ability to function in school. And 504, the disabilities that they can have are considered to be an impairment, a physical or mental, that substantially limits a major life activity. So anything that can affect someone from doing something. Now, moving on to Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, but it started in 1975, and this law requires and provides support to states to implement a plan to provide free education and appropriate relation services. In 1978, the Gift and Talented Children Educational Act. This act provides financial incentives for state and local educational agencies to develop programs for gifted and talented students. And then in 1983, the Amendments of Education of Handicapped Act. Um, they added on to the Education of Handicapped Act. And these amendments mandated states to collect data on students with disabilities exiting system and addresses transitions needed of secondary students with disabilities. In 1984, the Perkins Act happened. This act mandated that 10% of all vocational education funded must be for students with disabilities. Vocational education should provide in a least restrictive environment. Secondary support is provided for students with disabilities. In 1986, the Rehabilitation Act amendments. These amendments provide for development of support employment programs for adults and disabilities. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act happened, and that mandated that individuals with disabilities should be provided with reasonable accommodations in the workplace, and that such individuals could not be discriminated against. ADA includes protection for individuals enrolled in college and universities, whereas IDEA does not. It only goes from IDEA only goes to high school. So there's another difference. But what they all have in common is that they all go to support what the least restrictive environment can be for a student with special needs. Now, they're all a little different in their ways, like I discussed, especially with Section 504 and IDEA, but they all help. And I think that's my presentation. Thanks for listening.